Hey, Truth Nation, we're back again. It's this time of year, right? We've got the announcement coming out very shortly around inflation from the Bureau of Labor and Statistic. And we want to share some insights from the source of truth, the Truflation Stream Network, pulling from the data that's on there. We have our data science team run and led by Oliver, who really compiles a lot of these indexes, as you've met and heard from before, and various podcasts. He puts together this report every single month around inflation and where we see, from a macro perspective, where we see the industry at this time, leveraging our data and then reconfiguring it to adjust it to sort of what we can sort of, based on the insights that we have, where the government will be going. So, Oliver, maybe you just want to walk us through sort of what you've found, and sort of go through this presentation a little bit and the insights that you've gained and garnered from your work.
Yeah, sure. And it's great to be back online, and thanks for having me. I think overall, I think the situation, at least that we're seeing in the US, is that we're seeing the data seems to pointing us in a viewpoint that the consumer is increasingly becoming more bifurcated and more split. And I think that is increasingly becoming a struggle with the differences of spending behavior and expenditures and lifestyles of those of the low income earners, which are showing signs of stress via the rising auto and credit card debt, while the middle class and high income consumers are continuing to consume. And that bifurcation is certainly an existing trend that we're seeing. Now, having said that, I think there are certain data points where the US inflation has been holding relatively stable over the last couple of months. But there are some early signs of the US economy starting to show some weakness. But you could also interpret this into a split view of the data. So this is potentially early signs, but by no means it is a locked-in viewpoint that Truflation has, or that you should interpret this as a trend that's happening. And that is the US economy softening? And I think when we look at some of the data sets that you see on the chart here, where the ISM manufacturing index has contracted to 48.7 in the current month, again that is below expectations, and under 50 represents a contraction. And this is a reversal of an expansion of what we saw in the previous month. I think the other one is the JOLT report producing an 8.1 million number of job openings. Again, a lot lower than expectations of 8.4. But again, the BLS employment situation report came out at the end of last week, and they mentioned that they were 272,000 new jobs put onto the market, which is a significant jump from the previous month upwards, which is more of a positive sign compared to what the JOLT report was producing. And unemployment notched up to 4%. I mean, it's still extremely low, so we should be mindful of that. So, you're seeing retail sales be more cautious and dampen a bit. You're seeing the same with the consumer expenditure. And I think if we look at just those sets of figures, I think the key thing is we are seeing some potential signs of a slowdown in economic growth and domestic consumption. But I would add to that is that we're starting to see the year from a position of extraordinary strength. And yes, while the US economy might moderate, perhaps to grow in line with long-term trends, I don't think this is a sign of, at present, that we'll be entering into a recession.
But if you look at these numbers, Ollie, I mean, one thing we're seeing, 4%. I think the U.S. unemployment rate, unemployment number has not hit 4% for a long time, right? I mean, this is the first time we've broken the 4% barrier. You're talking to like Facebook, right? They've kept They reduced, I think, like 2-3 years ago, they reduced their headcount down from 90 to 60K, somewhere in that number, and they've held steady on the 60K. So there's been no new hires; it's been all hires. And then if you look at the new job hires, e.g., amongst those 272,000, you've seen a lot more foreign-born sort of employment versus local born employment. I don't know how they define that, but that was an article I saw on Zero Hedge. How do you see that? And then come back to saying the economy's in a strong position. How do you see those elements balancing each other out?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say that these are signs of early, these are potential signs of a slowdown in the U.S. economy, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't quite come to the conclusion that yet they've got into a recession. I do also believe that the U.S. economy has started the year in 2024 really strongly, and that's of an extraordinary position that the U.S. has found itself coming out of 2023. Now, into the current employment market, I think what is happening by interpreting the results is I think companies are increasingly taking the opinion of, well, I'm not going to start recruiting and expanding a lot more significantly now. I'm going to take a wait and see approach, and it's one in, one out. If we let someone go, we might be able to replace that person. And so, therefore, you're seeing the total number of job openings reduce. And therefore, the unemployment market is notching up a bit. But to be frank, it's still 4%. Yes, it's the highest it's been over 3 years, but it's still significantly low. And it's been hovering around 3.9, 3.8 for the last year already. So it's been pretty stable. I think the bigger concern for me is if you look at the growth of the number of jobs that have been employed in the US in the last month, i.e., the 272,000, they've come through in the typical standard three categories where we've always seen them grow in the last couple of years. So, to your point, out of these categories, yes, we're probably seeing
That's
significant
interesting. Yeah.
contraction. And,
Yeah.
and those categories are government services and government organizations, whether it's the federal government or state government or city government, or it's the leisure and entertainment industry. And we saw a big boom in that post COVID. And, I think that's probably settling back into some sort of normality in there. And consumers are worried about the spending on food categories and dining out when the prices of dining out is going up. And I think the other category where we're seeing significant growth rated is in the health category. And the health category has always seen a higher rate of inflation than we've seen in all other categories since January 2010. And I think that's because the US is going into an aging population, and that trend's going to continue.
Interesting. I think that was really interesting. I think that insight around new employment actually coming from government and healthcare, right? Both categories that have seen significant inflation above and beyond what we've seen in sort of the average, the national averages, especially in the health sector, right? I think, and government, what we should be doing is lightening up the government and streamlining the budget deficits so that we can operate faster and allow innovation to flourish without it putting more impediments in the way of already a tough job as an entrepreneur and make it even harder for them. But I think the other thing you highlight here is the confidence, right? The consumer confidence, their credit card payments. It seems that the delinquencies are coming back, so are dropping, meaning people can pay their credit card. So does that mean that people are more confident or less confident?
Yeah, so the credit card debt is coming down. It's dropped for the first time, as far as I can remember, and can't remember it is, but certainly more than about 3.5 years of data. And I think that is a good sign. I think that comes back to the comment I made earlier, with the bifurcation of the consumers, which generally en masse and on a totality basis, that the balance sheets of households is improving. Now, I think there is a dramatic difference of middle income and high income versus the low earners. I think there is a significant difference of trends there. But en masse, yes, we're seeing a balance sheet that's relatively improving and relatively positive sign. As a result of that, for the first time ever, first time in the last 4 months, we've seen a rebound in consumer confidence. It's gone up in May again. And I think that's more of a result of the consumers and how they're viewing the labor market, because their wage increases are still above inflation, and I think that puts a positive spin on it. I think the labor market, they're able to find more jobs. That's continuing to put some of that. And I think finally the stock market has started this year at a really positive rate, and I think that's given people more optimism.
I think interesting, right? So this is contrary to you and your team have been working on a Truflation consumer confidence index, right? Which is slightly different to what we see from Michigan. Because if you look at the Michigan numbers, they're telling you the consumer is more depressed and worried and heavy loaded because that's coming from survey data, right? And I think you're taking the data, or maybe I shouldn't steal too much information from the product that's coming soon, but there's a really cool consumer confidence index that you're working on, which is actually pulling social media data to get the sentiment across social media and then converting that with AI into a sentiment that is reflective of a more positive environment than actually what is reported through surveys and forms and checklists and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's 100% correct. I think it gives
Yeah.
us a much more balanced viewpoint of how the consumers are reacting, and how their viewpoints are. But yes, I do believe that consumer confidence has rebounded, and I think the stock market has a lot to do with that. I think this month, in the month of May, which is what we're talking about here, I think there's also the Memorial Weekend, and that might have buoyed people's viewpoints. So it could be a blip, but I think there's certainly the sentiments that people are having out there is certainly a lot more positive than it has been.
I think, the big question everybody's going to ask, so what's your number? What's your number? What's your prediction? What are we guessing it to come out at, right? It's like they don't want to see the Truflation CPI, right? The true CPI, which is actually down at 2%, 2+% versus the 3.3, 3.2, 3.4. What is the number we think it's going to come out at? And how does that contrast compared to what the market is expecting?
Yeah, so we are expecting the Truflation CPI. We're forecasting the BLS number in May to come out at 3.3%. The range that the market is expecting is ranging anything from 3.2. The latest update I've got is up to 3.5. But the average of the market is expecting is a 0.3% month on month. We're expecting a 0.2% increase month on month, and therefore the gap of 0.3 to 0.4. So that's the major difference. I think for us, where we're starting to see things cooling down in certain categories is around the services based, as the rate of wage increases cools, and of course around the petrol and gas categories where the price of oil commodity prices have dropped, and that's also affecting a downward pressure.
Yeah, interesting. So we're expecting a 3.3, the government to come out with a 3.3 number versus the spectrum, which ranges between 3.2 and 3.4. And I think here you've highlighted a number of areas, right? And I think the things that really impact household are really the utilities, right? Gas costs, which impacts transportation costs. I mean, clothing has a less of an impact on the actual household spending, but utilities and gas really matter, right? What are we seeing there, and why are we seeing that rise on both fronts, right? I guess gas prices rising leads to rising costs in utilities, right? Is there a
Yeah, so
direct
gas.
correlation?
No, so gas and certain utilities have a direct correlation because they're based on the commodity of oil, right? And so depending where the
Yeah.
oil commodity prices are going, will give you an indication at least where the gas prices are going, because roughly 50% of that's translated into gas prices at the pump. So yeah, gas prices coming down this month because the commodity prices have come down this month. But interestingly, the US, at the rate of its production, is now one of the highest countries of producing oil at the moment, and it's actually restocking its SPR reserves. And we don't expect the gas prices to go up again, especially in the current election year and the promise that Biden has made. If the prices were to go up again from a commodity standpoint, my guess is that the U.S. government would release more of the SPR to allow the prices to remain relatively stable and lower, and then continue to commit on Biden's promise of bringing inflation down where consumers feel it the most. And I think on
So if
utilities, it's got other categories. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So if gas prices are coming down, the the SPR has been restacked, so there's less supply going into the market from the U.S. producers, and the OPEC consortium has also agreed to reduce production on their side. How come, given supply coming down, does that mean demand is dropping for oil? Or is
Not
it just
yet.
the summer months that people don't need oil, or
No,
they
I think
need
they
less oil?
do. I think they do. I don't think there's any change in obviously in patterns of oil consumption en masse. I think yes, you
Yeah.
got pockets where certain environments and in certain cities there's a incremental gas car tax, for example, versus an electric car tax that's not there. So there's certain areas where there are benefits of that. But I think overall, the reason for the gas prices coming down is commodity prices are coming down, and the U.S. is producing. The U.S. is less concerned now about OPEC because they're the biggest producers in the world, like country-wise. And based on that, they can supply all their oil, and on top of that, they can then replenish their strategic petroleum reserves. So it's more of a question now saying in the future, what will happen to demand, and will demand come down? Now, you've got obviously the motor industry that requires oil, there's utilities that require oil, but there's also a mass amount of logistics that require oil. So you think of all the other shipping costs, logistics costs that goes around the world for all our goods and services that are no longer going through the canals, right? And they're going now down around the Cape of Good Hope. You have the bridge that has collapsed in Baltimore. You've got the freeze in February, which caused a bit of concerns. All those require more and more shipping costs, which is going to require more oil. So I think demand is the big question. Will that tap it off in the back end or the remaining part of this year? And I think we'll start to see a bit of a taper off in demand, but I think the prices will hold roughly. It will come down maybe a bit more, but not much more.
Interesting. Interesting. And I think the other thing that you talked about earlier, health, right? Health, I think is, yeah. So you have some insights around healthcare that matters to a lot of people. Housing obviously is about 23% of overall spend, ex utilities, right? So but yeah, how I share a bit more about the housing and how, especially health. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, so the health category has continued to outstrip the rate of growth of overall inflation. In other words, it's been higher growth rates than inflation has en masse for the last 15 years. And in part, that's due to increased pharmaceutical costs, their latest technology advances it's had. But I think in more recent cases, we have seen an increased administrative and government regulatory impact on the health sector that's requiring them to keep up with that, and therefore that's going to increase their costs they're passing on to the consumer, and that is all driven by the labor market. I think there's also an incremental significant advances consumer that the health industry has made in terms of technology, and that's also driving increased talent and increased specific bespoke requirements of that talent, and that wages of those talents are increasing faster, and therefore that's where you're also seeing the job rate increases, jobs increases in this category. I mean, I think from a long-term perspective, I don't see this changing anytime soon, right? I think we are seeing a very much more of an aging population in the U.S. The expectations at the moment is that the U.S. is going to increase from about currently around we have about 45 million people above the age of 65, and that number is going to go up to 95 by 2060. So, that has all sorts of consequential impacts on the industry, with more innovation, more pharmaceutical costs, more visits, hospital visits, and so forth, and that's going to increase over time. So I think the health category is a really interesting category. I think most recently also you're seeing people taking on health factors and concerns they've had potentially during the pandemic, and they're being scheduled now, and that's also increasing the insurance costs that people are incurring at the present time. The other category is housing, and I find this housing category the most fascinating of all. And I think you alluded to the importance of housing on the U.S. consumer, and I think it's a significant impact. I think here the housing costs, you break it down into two elements. You're breaking it down into rented and owned. There is a third component, which we call other lodgings, which are hotel costs, Airbnb, and things like that. That has gone significant growth this month. And I think a lot to do that is the increased number of travelers and the Memorial Day weekend. So we're expecting that to increase, especially when we go into the election, the final stages of the election year. And I think, as business travel goes more and more and more, it will take up more occupancy rates, and that's going to increase the rates in the long run for consumers who travel as well. Now, the owned market and the rented market, I think in a nutshell, what you're seeing here are two factors that we need to be concerned about. One is the supply, and we're massively undersupplied in the marketplace. You've seen that on the top chart there. We currently have roughly about 1.2 million homes on the market that are vacant and opportunity to purchase or rent. And that needs to more than double. That needs to get up to it needs to increase by another 1.5 million, which would give you roughly at a current run rate of about 6 months of inventory levels in the marketplace. And we're currently just under 3. So gives you an idea. We need to, on average, we need to double the rate of inventory that we have in the market. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, especially when you look at the number of housing starts, you look at the new builds that are happening, the new builds are being completed, and the new builds that have licensing approvals, right? It's just not enough volume to offset this more than doubling of inventory that's required in the marketplace. I think the second factor that we've been looking into is the impact of interest rates reductions, right? And if you look on the whole history since this started with the monthly records of new mortgages that are taken out, you have seen that there's been an increased spike of new mortgages issued if interest rates at our current levels were to drop by about 1.5% levels from where they are today. That means dropping from roughly around 7 to around 5.5, between 5.5 and 6%. And then you'll see a surge in demand of new households being taken. And that will just drive up prices, especially if the inventory situation has not been resolved. So that to me has much more of a longer term consequential impact of what will happen in the housing market and how its progression, and the connection to the rate reduction is critical here.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that the interest rates coming down equal property prices moving up significantly as a result of the lack of supply in the market, but then also the appetite maybe to actually see a trend that interest rates are continuing to come down. But I think, given the election year that we've got now, given the fact that we've heard promises from Trump that he's going to drop interest rates, he's going to push and promote the economy. I think, maybe that will do a resurge in the housing market, and we'll see a boom in that sort of sector, which will drive up inflation again, right? I mean, that'll only lead to more inflation over the longer run.
Yeah, and
and then
it's his.
huh?
It's
What?
his golden goose, right? He knows the property market, the housing market's got a lot of investments in there, and so I wouldn't be surprised if he does win the election. You'll see some favorable impacts on the housing market that will help him.
Yeah, I think he doesn't see eye to eye with Jerome Powell either. So I think there's going to be a big change, or attempt to change and bring that in-house, right? So you won't have any more of that separation of Federal Reserve and Treasury Secretary. You'll see them sort of boom collide together and maybe become one, and just treat the accounts as pretty much. I mean, Jerome Powell is anyway Yellen's beck and call. She does really control the finger. She does have the finger at the trigger at the moment. But yeah, so what do we see for the rest of this quarter, or how the last quarter, the second quarter of this year will perform before we head into the summer months?
Yeah, so look, we think the inflation numbers reported by the BLS will come down a bit more in June, but I don't think that we should assume that that's going to result in inflation coming down under the 3%, or coming closer and closer down to the 2% mark for the end of the year. I think long-term wise, but post-summer and during the end of the summer and post into the Q4 in the fall season of 2024, you will see that the inflation will rise again. So what are the factors that we think will reduce inflation, create like a hockey stick effect, will drop in the next couple of months? They have certain factors that we think cost of services are going to come down further with the softening of the labor market, and then the suppression of the wages. That's going to bring down the cost of services down. I think you've got overall concerns about what's going to happen with the oil prices. But I think the government will step in there with adjusting that with the SPR and keep the gas prices lower. The other factor that we need to consider, of course, is student loans. And I think student loans, the government has relieved about $167 billion of that has been waived. And I think in due course, that's going to find its way back into the market, and it's going to drive inflation upwards. There's going to be an inflationary pressure on there. And that's on the short term. So I think there'll be certain things that'll balance each other off, but we'll start to see a mitigation of inflation in the next couple of months. I think then in the longer term, we've got to deal with the structural elements of inflation that's sitting in the marketplace. And until these are resolved, I don't see how inflation gets down. And this is bad news, in my view, for the Fed and how they're going to deal with the interest rates. But what are those factors? One is the onshoring of green energy and semiconductor businesses. That is only going to increase costs because they're predominantly doing the green energy costs overseas. They're importing them generally at a lower cost, and that's going to be a concern to deal with. I think the housing market, which we spoke about, is going to be another factor on there. I think the logistical costs of the shipping, especially the shipping industry, I think prices are going to remain elevated until Q4, and that's going to put pressure on the goods costs that we purchase every day in our markets. And then also what is the commodities, the impact of the raw materials like cocoa, like copper, like steel, that affect things like producing new TVs, having coffee, having chocolate, and all these type of things, right? They all have an impact, and I think that's something to be concerned about as we go forward. But I think
what's your view on
go
just on that note, right? I mean, I think it's sort of alluding to everything is going to be inflationary, right? All the movements in the economy are indicating towards inflation. If we look at the U.S. economy as standalone, the other element that other people are saying is China has this huge manufacturing backlog, right? They've invested a lot in manufacturing. They've built out the capability to support manufacturing, and they now are looking to drive consumption of the products that they've manufactured, e.g. EV vehicles and other assets that they've created or products that they've created. How do you see that being deflationary on the rest of the world, right? Because they're willing to actually go and acquire market share with that backlog of product and their economies of scale that they've achieved, given that they were the world's producing and manufacturing hub. How will they drive that deflationary pressure into markets, and will that have an impact?
That's a good question. I think the answer to that is how the markets that are importing those products are going to deal with it from an import duties and a tax perspective, right? The US has already put up that tax incentives quite highly on the EV market. I know organizations, countries like the US have also put import duties on products that are made in certain parts of China, and all that is resulting in manufacturing that is being produced in China is now being produced in China, but also in other markets around the world that are potentially more favorable for the US import market, but they use China for importations into other parts of the world. So maybe, for example, into Europe or into other parts of Southeast Asia and so forth. So I think, this notion of the China impact on globalization and the deflationary environment, I think what we have seen that impact be over the 2010s, I don't think we'll see in the 20s and maybe into the 30s again, who knows. But I think in the current 20s mark, where we've seen the impact they've generated over the noughties and into the 2010s, I don't think we'll get a repeat of that now in 2020. And I think we're starting to see, and that's also why the US government is putting incentive plans as part of its Inflation Reduction Act into the green energy and the semiconductor. They want to onshore that element back into the US. And I think other countries are thinking of the same. So I think it's going to be very picky and selective of which industries are best suited for those type of activities. but I think in certain markets around the Europe, you'll start to see those deflationary impacts maybe accelerating again, and it allows then some of the other markets to get more competitive on those categories or those areas or sectors that those governments choose not to imply more import duty taxes on.
There you get it, guys, everybody, Truth Nation. You've heard it here first, the insights into where the economy is going, our thoughts, our discussions that we have internally, the data team and what they're working on. So stay tuned. We'll have a consumer confidence index coming very soon, and we'll have more insights into the EV market associated with the EV index that we've launched. So there's some interesting insights that we'll be sharing with you along with the Twitter spaces coming up, and then on the FOMC meeting tomorrow around interest rates. So join into those to learn more. We won't release more here, but we've got lots more insights that we want to share and are itching to share. But you have to sign up to the Truflation.com dashboard or get the data feeds from the TSN network. Thank you for that. And thank you, Ollie. Thanks for your time. I know you're super busy and it's super late where you're at. But yeah, that's always good. And hopefully the community appreciates what you've been working on. Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.